What's up, Geeks and Gamers? It's Odin coming back with the box office a breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Blue Beetle finally dethrone the Barbie film, getting the #1 domestic release of the box office. However, don't believe what Tony and some of the other people online are trying to tell you about how somehow this is an amazing feat, seeing that this is, the 4th or 5th weekend of Barbie, and this is the opening weekend for Blue Beetle, and Blue Beetle barely beat out the entire total for this weekend after so many weeks of release for Barbie. And so let's just go ahead and say Blue Beetle's opening is pretty abysmal. It is one of the worst openings for a DCEU movie ever. Only one other film actually did a little bit worse than this one, and there's a lot of reasons as to why it did as bad as it did. So we'll talk about that today, and we'll also, of course, talk about the updates for Strays and a plethora of other movies. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So Tony over at Deadline, as we all know, he's my favorite box office coverage person over at Deadline ever, especially since Nancy is always a little bit behind on the numbers, it seems. But as it says right there, Blue Beetle lands at $25 million. Now, what's interesting is that going into the weekend, the so-called industry experts were saying, it's going to make somewhere between $28 and $32 million. And then it only ended up making 25. So this came in well underneath the projections. Even Box Office Pro had the film making on average around $26 million. So they were a little bit more correct because their range was $22 million to around $32 million. And so the fact that they did have that lower end clearly opens them up for having a little bit more accuracy there. And sure enough, this film is going to be pretty close to that $26 million that they had originally been projecting. Not anywhere close, though, or at the very least, not nearly as close to the original numbers that Tony was pushing before going into the weekend. It says, even though this weekend's new entries, Blue Beetle and Strays, aren't coming in at the top of their projections with respective lower weekends of 25.4 and 8.3, the overall health of the theatrical business is still in good shape. Tony, how can you honestly say that? Obviously, you're going to try and say, because look at how Barbie is doing, look at how Oppenheimer is doing, we're going to have to look at the entire weekend collectively, and I get that to a certain point, to a certain extent, but you're trying in a lot of ways to say, Blue Beetle's individual numbers don't seem all that great, but this is actually still fine for the overall box office market itself. It just honestly seems to me like you're just trying to spin a little bit more of a positive story around this movie when the reality is this film came in underneath projections, which is never a good thing. And right now, the prospects for this movie, especially when you compare it to other films that did better this year, films like The Flash and Shazam, both of which opened higher and were also both box office flops, with Shazam having a closer production budget to that of Blue Beetle. Let's just say right now, things are not looking good for this movie. If you want to have a better understanding of this, I actually have a ticket sales chart. This is something that I've been updating over the course of the year when first Shazam 2 came out, and then I updated it further with The Flash. But if you look at these numbers right here, these are all numbers that have been adjusted for inflation as well, and have also been able to get the average, or what likely was the opening weekend ticket estimates. And this is, again, I do this by taking what the overall projections were for that domestic weekend, and then I take the average movie ticket price at the time, divide it, and of course, that's how you get your number. What's interesting to me about all of this, though, is this is the worst opening. This is the worst opening unless you are counting Wonder Woman 1984 from 2020. And we all know when it came to Wonder Woman 1984, not only was that movie terrible, but that film also was literally in the midst of COVID, and also was in the midst of that day-and-date release model that HBO Max was doing very, very quickly upon initial releases. And so it makes a lot of sense then as to why the film did not make nearly as much money back in 2020. So what is Blue Beetle's excuse? Maybe it's because the DCEU is in utter shambles. This, of course, being the first canonical character in James Gunn's new universe. Apparently, he's walked back some of his comments saying, this movie is not necessarily as a film in my new DCEU, but the character at the very least is. It just seems like he is trying to have everything. He's trying to have his cake and eat it too. Reminds me a lot about the whole conversation when he was releasing The Suicide Squad, even though there had already been a simple just Suicide Squad movie, and the questions on which characters are still there, which actors are still going to be a part of the universe, keeping some on, not keeping the others, or at least not being able to get some of the others into your movie. It's a giant mess. The DCU is still in a huge mess right now, and I think that this number is absolutely showing that. This is an unknown character that's really not making any waves whatsoever. The film is just not good. The characterization, done of the character of Jaime Reyes, I think that the actor who did that role is great. He's great in Cobra Kai, but when you don't have a good script, when you don't have a good director behind the camera, guess what? You're not going to get a good movie, and the marketing campaign pretty much being almost non-existent for this movie, or at the very least not being effective for this movie, means this movie is going to end up being quite a big financial loss for Warner Brothers. And so even though Warner Brothers has a bit of a victory with Barbie this year, it's not getting all of those box office receipts. It's splitting that with theaters just like any other studio, but then it also, any profits it does get in, it's going to be splitting with Mattel in some way. So even though that's going to be able to make up, the profits from Barbie are going to be able to make up some of the losses from this year, to say that it's going to make up both the losses, the $100+ million losses of Shazam, likely the $100+ million loss of Blue Beetle, and the $200 or so million loss for The Flash, not likely going to happen. So yeah, couldn't happen to a nicer company or to a nicer studio. Let's go ahead and jump into the domestic numbers, though, as just to show you how close this number was. So as you can see, Blue Beetle has finally taken the number 1 spot for Barbie, actually in its 5th weekend of release. So as I said, it was like the 4th or 5th, indeed the 5th weekend of release for this movie. Still out in, as far as Barbie's concerned, over 4,000 screens. So it still has a wider release than a brand new Warner Brothers film in Blue Beetle. And Blue Beetle is projected to have made $25.4 million, which is around $6,500 per screen. So just look at how close that per theater ratio is. So even though it came in at the number 1 spot does not mean anything if you are barely ahead of a film that's been out for 5 weeks. And when your per theater ratio is just barely a little bit better for a film that's been out, again, for 5 weeks, meaning a lot of people have had the opportunity to already go see the movie. And so right now it's being continued on with people who either were waiting for less people to be at the theater or people who are going to see it multiple times. I don't quite understand it myself, but hey, those people clearly exist based on the numbers that we're seeing, with it only dropping another 36% after 5 weeks. This film is well on its way to making just a crap ton more money and making massive profits for Warner Brothers and Mattel in the process. As I mentioned, though, Warner Brothers has a little bit big of a problem because it's got a lot of financial losses this year. So Blue Beetle, congratulations, you got the number 1 spot. Does not mean anything when the number that you're making your opening weekend is barely ahead of a film, an actual successful film in Barbie that is out now in its 5th week of release. Coming in the number 3 spot is Oppenheimer. So we still see this kind of 1-2 punch there with Barbenheimer, still pretty much in effect at this point, dropping a very similar amount of money. Interesting that Oppenheimer had a little bit of a steeper drop. So that's kind of, I think, the widest drop difference percentage-wise that we've actually seen between these two movies. But hey, it does kind of make a little bit of sense when you just think about the different kinds of movies that they are and also just where they currently are in their release cycle and their release schedule. But as you can see, Oppenheimer at $10.6 million, a drop of 440 screens. Still a pretty decent per theater ratio there after 5 weeks. Oppenheimer crossing $700 million worldwide, looking very good. Number 4 spot goes to TMNT Mutant Mayhem. I did indeed say that last weekend. This film looks like it is going to be a flop, and I'm pretty much standing by that. I will say, though, if you are going to be looking at just the box office numbers, it probably will end up losing money. It really did not add a whole lot of money globally from last weekend to this weekend. It's adding enough to where it could potentially eke out a break even. The way that this movie, though, is going to be successful for Paramount is the fact that when you look at the overall retail sales for the Ninja Turtles, it is already this year at $1 billion. So the year's not even over, and they've already made about $1 billion in retail sales. So even if this film does still end up being a flop, they're not going to be far off financially speaking. They could easily still justify making more of these movies because they're going to be looking at the bottom line of just the overall universe and how much money that's bringing in, regardless of whether this film ends up being a flop or not. So again, I know some people might have been fighting back in the comment section about that very fact, but hey, we have to look at the numbers for the box office specifically, and right now it's not looking too great, it's not looking too strong, though, again, I have seen much worse films, and as I said, this film and this franchise will be in decent shape because of those retail sales. And lastly, the number 5 spot goes to Strays, the brand new rated R film with dogs speaking badly, and this film cost over $40 million, so this is not a good start for it, $8.3 million. So again, early indications seem to say the film probably won't make its money back, but we'll have to wait and see. Blue Beetle at $43.4 million. That's right, 43.4 global opening weekend for Blue Beetle. That is just abysmal. Remember that when it came to Shazam 2, that film opened to $30 million, right? If we go back to the ticket sales chart, right, that film opened to $30 million. The Flash opened up to 55. This one at 25, as I said, is only just ahead of where Wonder Woman 84 was, where that film made around $19.7 million. And again, these numbers have been adjusted for inflation, but hopefully you can understand and realize that, hey, yeah, ticket price and showing you the differences in ticket sales in general, and also comparing that to what we would likely see as far as domestic and inflation, they're actually pretty comparable to each other, right? $25 million versus $19 million, 1.9 million tickets versus 1.7. Again, that's the reason why I do think adjusting for inflation is just as accurate or just as, kind of showing you what's going on as it would just if you were looking at overall ticket estimates for a given opening weekend. The film Barbie, as of the recording of this video, has not updated its international. I'll try and refresh it one more time just to see. Nope, has not updated it yet, but that is, I think, a huge deal. It's at $1.227 billion. Once they update those international numbers, I would not be surprised if it is able to eke up closer to 1.3 billion. The reason why I mentioned that is because Nancy has not released her international numbers. A lot of other places have not. The only international release that's being talked about currently is Oppenheimer as of the recording of this video. And when I went ahead and looked to their international charting, even though we know these categories are not updated by the numbers right away, those take a couple of days after the fact, it did say that the international total, the last time it was updated, was on the 18th. So 2 days ago. But that's, again, a great thing for Barbie. If this film is looking to get to 1.3, it could end up potentially beating out the Super Mario Brothers movie, actually, internationally, as of either today. At the very least, though, we're looking at this film definitely getting to that point by next weekend. We're looking at this movie getting closer to $1.4 billion probably by the end of next weekend, which means it's now starting to kind of make its way towards taking down another film that was very successful both domestically and internationally, more so domestically, from last year, and that is Top Gun Maverick. So Barbie could end up not only dethroning, it will, at this point, I'm pretty confident, will dethrone the Super Mario Brothers movie from this year. It will be the biggest grossing movie to come out this year, just globally. It's already done that domestically, but it will continue to add on to those numbers internationally too. But it also has a good chance of being the highest grossing film of just the last couple of years, really. Not of course taking into account a film like Avatar, which is not going to be able to be beaten by any film anytime soon. Oppenheimer at $700 million, very impressive 3-hour drama, making $700+ million. Again, has a lot of people to think over with the Barbenheimer effect for sure. $118 million for TMNT. So again, not the worst numbers in the world, but also as far as an individual film release is concerned, with how much they spent on it, definitely not what they would want for this movie, but financially, they're going to be fine because of those other sales. And then the number 5 film, Strays, $10.3 million worldwide. As I said, just really not doing a whole lot of anything. And because they spent probably too much money on this movie, probably will not end up making its money back. If we go ahead and look at the box office charting, because we love doing charting here over at Geeks and Gamers, as I mentioned with Blue Beetle, right? Some of the early estimates for the budget were around $120 million. Apparently, the director has come out to say it's actually closer to $104 million. In either case, we're not looking at this movie getting to its break-even point. Right, even if you take into account a lower estimated budget, and even if some people have been arguing that the marketing probably isn't standard marketing, and again, for me, standard marketing is budget times 1.5 gives you your total cost. So at a $120 million budget, it would put the film closer to around $180 million of total actual cost. Some people have said that it might have actually cost a little bit less than that because of that reason. But even at the break-even point is $250 million, you're still looking at a movie starting at 43.4, and the chances of it getting to even 250 probably aren't actually going to happen. Just to give a little bit of a refresher here, right? $43 million opening weekend. If we try and compare that to the other films that have come out from the DCEU, right? The Flash film, obviously a lot more behind that film, $130 million, but a film that's on a similar plane, right? As far as the overall cost and everything like that. If we try to find the overall numbers here for the last Shazam movie, let me see if it can pop up here. Almost forgot that it came out the time that it did. Oh my goodness. This is why we do things live here over on Geeks and Gamers, because it is a lot of fun. And when I have charting like this, sometimes it can be hard to find. And there it is. Sure. Okay. So here we go. Shazam 2, Fury of the Gods. Sorry about that. We got there. 65.5 though. So not only did Shazam have a higher domestic opening weekend, it had a higher international opening weekend, 65 versus 43. Let's just say again, Blue Beetle is pretty much donezo. Add to that it's not a good movie. Add to that there's a lot of problems in the film. We talked about that on Friday Night Tights this past week. It is not looking good. This film probably will end up being a $100 million loss for Warner Brothers, and that's kind of the standard for them as far as their DCEU movies are concerned. Probably $100+ million for almost every single film that they've had this year alone from any DC property. Yeah, that is definitely a terrible place for it to be. Strays, as I mentioned, at $46 million of a budget, its break even is roughly $115 million. So, as I said, it's not going to be the biggest loss of the year, but it's not going to be a success either. We do have the second weekend numbers for The Last Voyage of the Demeter, and I can now officially confirm this film will indeed be a flop. It's only made $11.4 million after 2 weeks, so its end point is going to be somewhere around $16 to $22 million. And based off of the fact they did spend $45, even though that budget is a lot smaller than some of the other films that we talked about, yeah, $57 million loss likely going to happen for this movie. In a, kind of a worst case scenario, $53 million in a best case scenario, and either way, still massive financial losses. If you look at the Meg 2 really hasn't been doing a whole lot. Again, it had that bigger than expected opening weekend, much thanks to China for that very reason. But notice how its first 2 weeks compare to its total right now. At 95%, that means that it made 95% of its entire box office so far in the first 2 weeks. Now, it's only been out for 3 weeks, but Ultimately, what that means is that this film really isn't adding a whole lot. Now, it could very well be that some of the international numbers have not updated. As I mentioned, Barbie's international numbers have not updated either, but it's just right now not looking great for this movie, which again, it won't end up being a massive loss. If it does still end up in the lost territory, my original projections had the film getting anywhere between 26 and 114 million in the black, but as I mentioned, since most of that money is going to be coming from China, that means that it actually has to make a little bit more than your standard film to make its money back. TMNT, as I said, has a chance of breaking even, making some profit, but either way, it's going to be fine just because of those retail sales. But those are the thoughts. Those are currently the numbers as they stand. If you want to have a full box office breakdown, including more films like Oppenheimer, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and plenty of others, go ahead and check out my channel over at OMB Reviews. But let me know your thoughts about any of these films in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button. Wherever that you're watching, smash it. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.